helped become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000 or send an email to openline@EWTN.com.
Happy Holiday Friday weekend to each and every one of you. It is Labor Day. How about that? I got it right. I usually mess up Memorial Day and Labor Day. It's the Friday of Labor Day weekend, and we are so grateful that you took a little time out of your Holiday Friday to join us here on EWTN's Open Line. If you'd like to be part of the program, our very own Vice President of Theology is in the house, and we are making him available to you. Simply call 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, even though it may not be Labor Day where you are, we would still love to hear from you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we will put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email, openline@EWTN.com. Or you can text your question to Colin. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. I'm Jack Williams, the lovely and talented Michael McCall, not only producing the program today, but handling your social media endeavors. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook Live, you can type a question into the chat window there. Mr. McCall will forward that on to us if he sees fit. And screening your phone calls today is Mr. Michael Birchfield. Our host, as he is every single Friday, our very own, as I mentioned, Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan, who was grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Is that correct, Colin?
Well, at least in my younger years, before we started moving around a little bit.
Then you moved to the Chicago. I know you spent a lot of time in the Chicago area. We're in the United States Navy. So do you have dual citizenship?
I do. I didn't for the longest time because when you were naturalized back in the 60s, as I was when my mother married an American, countries required you to renounce that. And here a few years ago, about 10 years ago now, Parliament in Canada rescinded all those renunciations and gave back citizenship. So I've had the odd experience of being told by Canadian Customs when I was heading for the foreigner's door, oh, no, you can go through the Canadian door over here. So it's a little bit strange, but I guess I technically have dual citizenship now because they gave it back to me.
Well, there you go. You know, I don't know that it how it applied in Canada so much, but here in the United States, you know, when I was a boy, it was, you know, you went to school essentially from Labor Day until Memorial Day. And, you know, nowadays, most kids, I think, in the United States have been in school for a couple weeks now as we approach Labor Day. And all I'm going to tell you is America was a better place when we went to school from Labor Day to Memorial Day.
Well, you know, and I think historically, I don't remember exactly our schedule, but I think historically they deferred to the harvesting seasons very often in terms of letting kids out who could work in the family fields and so on in May and June for planting and so on, because by the time the snow and the ice leaves Canada, in some parts it's that far into the year.
Yeah, well, and you were out there in Western Canada a little bit, Midwestern, but drifting towards Western Canada, where it's a lot of agriculture, huh?
Definitely called Western because it's pretty much Saskatchewan's over Montana and the Dakotas. So, yeah, drifting towards Western Canada.
Beautiful. You have an email or two there, Colin, from our listeners?
I do, here. Somebody is asking, let's see, Shea asks, I was wondering if there's a person being looked at today as the next Mother Teresa or Padre Pio. Someone who might be capable of being a modern saint we could look to. Well, I don't think we have to go farther than our own Mother Angelica. She didn't, there are a few things attributed to her. We'll leave that to any investigation that takes place. But I think she gave an example of witness to the faith that could certainly be looked to and admired at today. An example which also obviously Mother Teresa, Padre Pio, and most notably Pope St. John Paul II gave as well. So we'll see someday if the Church makes that determination or not. It's something fully in the control of the Church.
In her good time. In
her own good time, if that is the Lord's will, it will happen. Okay, let's see here. We have another one from Misty, who asks, Mr. Donovan, in today's society, every major company uses money it obtains through sales to support causes seriously objectionable and gravely sinful, such as abortion and same-sex relationships. Companies that have major influences on our lives, from Starbucks to Apple to Microsoft and so on, and the list goes on. There's the doctrine of double effect, and one of the tenets being that the good resulting from an action must be in proportion to the evil resulting from it. So I understand that the proximity of the material cooperation in the evil act is of no relevance insofar as this principle is concerned. Well, that's not completely true, because what the Church talks about in the principle of double effect, which says that you can't do anything yourself which is evil. You can't do something from the motive that something evil might come from it, but you could cooperate to the extent that the good effects outweigh the bad effects, and that the good effects come as immediately from what you do as the bad effects. So, for example, a good classic example, in wartime, the armies of the side which you could say is perhaps justly defending itself or justly executing war against its enemies, they bomb a munitions factory. The intention is to destroy the war capability. It's not simply to kill people or anything like that. To destroy that war capability, unfortunately, as directly connected to that act, will be the destruction of human life. Some of it will be innocent civilians, some of it may be workers, but in any case, they're not the ones waging war on you directly, except insofar as they're building munitions and so on. So the principle of double effect means that if you have the right intention to stop the war-making capability, you know that something bad might come from it, such as the loss of life of civilians or whether in the general population or among the workers, but yet you do it for that good reason, and the results that you get from it will be at least proportional to the destruction that your act produces as a bad effect, then you can justify going ahead with it. So how that applies in the modern situation is that we need to get our computers and our software from somewhere. We know that a lot of these companies are among the most liberal businesses in the country in their support for morally unacceptable practices, policies, and activities that as Catholics we can't accept. But we're not giving them the money for those activities. We're giving them in exchange for a product they sell or a service that they give. And we're not immediately connected in the way to that activity. Now, it would become more difficult for the officers of such a company who is a Catholic, who say immediately as a financial officer or executing the will of the corporate head, is in that pathway of giving money. Now we're talking about immediately. So for the ordinary Joe, it's like, you're paying your taxes and the government's going to use it for things that you don't agree with and maybe are immoral. But that's a little bit remote from you in time, causality, and your money goes into the big pot and who knows whether yours or somebody else's comes out. But if you're in that line and you're effecting the policy, you're doing the thing which is objectionable, or you're facilitating it immediately, that's where the moral issue begins. And even there, sometimes that may not be immediate. Immediate would be where you're assisting in a way that is essential to the fulfillment of that evil thing. So on that basis, you could say, you can work for the local drugstore and work as a cashier and take the money across the counter because you're just counting money and you're doing the adding up of the costs of the different things purchased and so on. And you can do that and call it remote cooperation. But it's more difficult for the pharmacist behind the counter who has to figure out, can I dispense the morning after pill or something like that? So it becomes more difficult the closer you get to the act. And with something like abortion, there's almost nothing that can justify doing anything immediately directly connected with serving or aiding such a facility because of the evil of killing human beings that's associated with it.
EWTN's Open Line Friday with our very own Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. The leading voices in the church today are here right on EWTN Radio, and one of the leading voices in the church in America is Bishop Robert Barron, and you can hear him every Sunday afternoon right here on EWTN Radio. Be sure to check out Word on Fire with Bishop Robert Barron, Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock Eastern Time, right here on EWTN Radio. The number to be on the program, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. To the phones we go. Our leadoff hitter today is Mark in New Orleans, Louisiana, listening on the almighty 690 Catholic Community Radio. Mark, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Can you hear me?
I sure can, Mark. Go ahead.
Colin, it's such a pleasure to be talking with you, but not in these times. It's because my topic is
Yep.
And we as listeners appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience so much. You bring so much to the process. But
well, thank you.
I'm a regular guy, but I love my church. I love my faith. I'm a defender of my faith. And what I see happening is not something that I'm surprised about because, things don't just happen. It's been going on for a long time. It's just now that it's surfaced. And I'm angry. I'm disappointed. I'm like a spouse that's been cheated on.
Yep.
And so I have to get over it. I have to forgive. And I'm in the process of doing that. But there's a part of me that says this needs to be rooted out by the roots. It's got to come all the way out. I mean, from the higher ups all the way to our Holy Father. Whatever's got to come out. And I'm frustrated in the sense that these people who are involved, who have criminally or civilly broken a law, how is it that at least this is my perception, and I'm sure a lot of people have the same perception. How is it that this is hush-hushed they're taken out of active role in a parish, and they're put in some quiet place to go contemplate their repentance. I just find that so unfair, and I know God He's the one who's going to ultimately decide this, and I have to get over whatever that decision is, but it just seems so unfair.
Right, and that's not the full extent of it. In fact, I can maybe do a little preview here of what we're going to talk about next week on our Theology Roundtable. Atonement. Christ atoned for sins, but each of us must make atonement for our own sins. So there's a lot that can be said about, the idea that mercy is gratuitous in the sense that it costs us nothing. We know it cost our Lord a great deal, but it's not that it costs us nothing. And like you say, there has to be consequences for the actions. Now, the thing about, go off to a monastery and that goes back to a time historically when the church, you can imagine when the world was Catholic, or at least the civilized Western world was Catholic, that the prerogatives of the church meant that when a member of the clergy was a sinner, that the church actually did the punishment. And so the punishment could be a life of penance, a life of seclusion, and so on and so forth. That's just not our world today. And so it's quite clear, for instance, in the norms of the church, as it was in the Dallas Charter, that the church has to cooperate with the civil authorities where civil crimes are committed, but it also should bring its own canon law to bear, because think of this. In addition to being civil crimes in most jurisdictions, there are things that are not civil crimes. So allegations that clergy had sexual relations with an adult, whether they're homosexual relations or heterosexual relations, would not be of concern to civil authorities today. But it is of concern to the church because of their promises of celibacy. It's a confessional issue for them personally, because each of us stands before God with our conscience every time we go to confession. So for the perpetrators, there's the confessional issue, the internal form, but there's also the external form. There's the canonical issues and the responsibility there to correct that scandal and to repair that scandal. And that surely is more than simply going into being given a life of quiet off somewhere, out of sight and out of mind. I think you have obligations to actually positively correct the scandal. Certainly you have an obligation to come forward and say, I injured these people. I take responsibility for that. And to acknowledge that, because that means healing for, as people who deal with abuse victims, is part of beginning the healing, or part of continuing extending any healing of the wounds that were caused by that person's activity, is that acknowledgement that I actually did wound you, I actually damaged you, hurt you, caused you psychological pain, maybe decades of it. So that element has to be there. There has to be that published acknowledgement of sin and so on. And I remember a classic example of this. I was completely startled by it. I was living, in the Pacific Northwest at the time, in the Seattle area. And I remember picking up a newspaper and reading an article written by a priest who had taught moral theology at a well-known Catholic university, and he had been teaching for many years dissent from Humanae Vitae, and he had guided people in the confessional regarding, their freedom of conscience to use contraception and so on and so forth. And maybe you can take that, extend that, and think of the priest who says, to another priest or to a religious brother or sister, yeah, you promise celibacy, but, if you can't take it, if you fall once in a while, that's no big deal. That's nothing. Maybe they've been giving that advice in the confessional. Well, this priest, when he had an awakening of his conscience, he published a letter to all the students he had taught, to all the people he had advised wrongly over the years regarding the moral law on sexual matters. Now that is reparation. That is undoing scandal. And I think that could be a model of what clergy should do who fall into any kind of category like that, where sinful behavior has impacted their ability to be a priest of Christ, to be a prophetic witness to the truth, and to live honestly a life that they, as clergy and their homilies and so on, are demanding of others to live a good Christian life, and they're not doing it. So I think you can't get away from the necessity of some kind of public self-revelation. But the trouble is, I think that's not going to happen in most cases. There will be the 1 or 2 or 10 or whatever number it is, people who get a moral awakening and they decide they're going to do that. Many will have to be revealed. It won't be until their moral and canonical failures are revealed publicly that their own conversion or moral conversion begins. So I think all of the calls for investigation, for getting at the truth of any allegations and claims, to getting at the roots of the problem, as you described, are absolutely necessary. It's for the good of the victims, it's for the good of the individuals themselves who did the evil things, and it's for the good of the whole church, because it's the beginning of the getting rid of the scandal that was caused by their actions in the first place. So that's what I hope we'll see.
Thanks so much, Mark. We appreciate the phone call. Next stop, Hermiston, Oregon. Alicia's in Hermiston, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Alicia, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I'm going to kind of step away from the scandal for a little bit. I'm a cradle Catholic, but I've been away from the faith for a while, and I've learned to do some energy healing, which I seem to think is probably not right with the Catholic faith. But even as a child, my hands would get extremely hot, where I didn't even want to put them on my own arm. And so with my hands doing that, it's called Reiki healing. And my hands get hot and really relaxes. And the whole time I'm praying, saying the Our Father and the Hail Mary and, guide me or whatever. But am I correct? Is this not right?
Well, Reiki is a kind of healing which is an Eastern practice. It's suggestive of relying upon unseen forces to accomplish the healing. Now, it's quite clear, in contradistinction from that you see it somehow as appealing to God himself and to him to help others, and that is certainly, I think, the beginning of renouncing the other elements of it. But Reiki per se is not considered to be a practice consistent with the Church's understanding of reality. There is one God. There are other powers who, good and evil, can do certain things, especially with matter, and we're allowed to pray to the holy angels, for example. We are allowed to have them pray for us and to assist us, as many people do, calling on their guardian angel every day. But it's somewhat dangerous. In fact, it's quite dangerous to appeal to such powers, not knowing to whom you're actually speaking, since there are other powers that are not with God and of God, to come to help you, even though you want to advantage people by bringing healing to them. It's just something the Church has not recognized. So I strongly discourage you from doing that. You don't know from where this ability comes from. You could certainly get the opinion of a priest who specializes in those kinds of questions, mystical theology, obviously demonology, and so on. Not that I'm saying that's necessarily what it is, but that's the Church's general experience with practices that have an appeal to forces other than God Himself. So I think you have to be very careful about that. I'm glad that you pray. That's certainly some protection for you, but I wouldn't suggest using this gift in quotes based on the little bit you know of what is its origin and source.
The number to be on the program is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. EWTN's Open Line Friday with our very own Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. The number to be on the program is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we'd love to talk to you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we'll put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can send us an email, openline@EWTN.com, or you can text your question to Colin. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question. Message and data rates may apply. Next up is Elsie. She's in Athens, Georgia, listening on the Sacred Heart app. Elsie, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Hey, hello.
Hey, Elsie.
Hi. So my question is, and I'm sure it's a harder question to answer, but I just would like some clarity, obviously coming from the church. So when we die, obviously if we are, if we get to heaven, we are told that we will be perfectly happy with God in heaven and also have a greater understanding of things. And so my question is, if you have passed and, you make it to heaven and there you are, and maybe you had loved ones that, maybe children or parents that fell away from the church or what have you. My question is basically, how can you be perfectly happy with God in heaven with the knowledge that there are souls suffering in hell, and then, if you are in heaven, we are told that we're going to be back reunited with our loved ones, and our loved one is not there because the loved one went to hell. I know that's a hard question to answer, but my understanding is, how can we then still be perfectly happy with God with that knowledge?
Okay, I'll ask you an even deeper question. How can God be perfectly happy since he loves all of those people who are in hell more than we loved them when they were in life?
Yeah.
See, this is the mystery
yeah.
of justice and of mercy, and that is, in justice, obviously, we all deserve to die. Jesus came and died on the cross so that we might not die eternally. Not that we're annihilated or anything, but dying eternally means the eternal punishment of hell. So God wills those individuals to be in heaven. And so, but they aren't. They chose, no, we don't want your will. We don't want to be with you. We want our own will. And he's given it to them. That's the justice of the situation. And you can also likewise say that, well, your aunt or uncle or child or parent or whoever who is there basically said, I don't only want to be with God forever, but the fact that I'm not going to be with my father, daughter, husband, whomever, doesn't change that equation. I want my own will. So that, too, is part of the justice of the situation. But if we want to look at it in sort of a more metaphysical way, we can think of God as, infinite charity. He would have saved them. He would have done everything if they had simply open the door a crack. You've seen that Christ knocking at the door in that famous painting. And he would have done, but they said no. But he still loves them. He loves them as human beings, but he cannot love the evil that they did and which they still cling to even in death, which they chose in death over the good, over him. And he's perfectly happy because of that perfect communion which he has with the Son and the Holy Spirit, which is a constant source of his beatitude, of the divine beatitude. And when we enter into that and we participate in that, under that guise that Scripture gives of the marriage feast of the Lamb and so on, when we enter into that eternal marriage feast, that eternal communion of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to which the just are also called to share, we will have the same sense of those kinds of consequences of human freedom and choice that God has. We won't understand it as deeply as he does. Obviously, we can't understand anything about him or even probably the life of another human being as deeply as God understands himself or that other human being understands themselves, and why they would choose God or why they wouldn't choose God and why they wouldn't choose to be with you in heaven too. But that will be something for us to ponder and glorify God for all eternity, that we have been the recipients of such a great grace ourselves. Perhaps on a human level, you would say if we had emotions which could be so bent to sadness, we would be sad too, but we won't, because we'll be filled with the possession of the beatitude which also fills God and all of the holy angels and all of the holy men and women who are with God. So there's a lot of mystery in there, but I think it's understandable on a certain basic level that they simply didn't choose to be with you, just as they didn't choose to be with God.
God bless you, Elsie. We appreciate that phone call. And Colin, faith tells me that I will be perfectly satisfied with the circumstances that everyone finds themselves in, should I have the great grace of being there.
Right, and even the last judgment, which each of us receive our judgment of death, the last judgment the Church's teaching is really more about that working out of history, and we will understand and see, too, all of this. Sometimes I think parents of a child has a drug addiction or something like that, when they get to know how the person got there, they can at least understand it. They may wish it were otherwise, but they'll know and understand it. And after the last judgment, we'll know the answers to all of those questions.
John is in New Brunswick, Canada, listening at EWTN.com today. John, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. What's your question today?
Good. Well, mine's a two-part question.
Okay.
With this thing that's going on with this sex scandal that's going on in the church, I've heard the term persona Christi mentioned a few times.
Sure.
And I'd like to know, the first part of the question is, I'd like to know how that developed. And I'm really having a hard time understanding how, for example, a priest can rape a child and then an hour later be in the confessional.
Sure.
Or an hour later be at the altar and offering Mass.
Sure.
I'm having a really hard time understanding how that can actually be right. Secondly,
well, it isn't right, but
marriage.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
We have a process of annulling a marriage, and that says that the sacrament wasn't valid. If a priest enters the priesthood in with bad intentions. And we had a priest here that said one time that he has an occupation, not a vocation. He didn't last long in the priesthood, but if a priest does enter the priesthood with bad intentions, how could that be a valid ordination?
Well, you're asking a lot of questions there. Let me go back to your first one, and we'll see if we can work our way down to that one. That's in persona Christi, the full expression is in persona Christi capitis, in the person of Christ the head. This comes from the sacramental nature of the priesthood. And that's not just the ministerial priesthood, but also our priesthood of baptism. In baptism, we enter into the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. And we undertake at different levels, the lay person and then the person who is ordained subsequently to the hierarchical offices, we undertake the priesthood of Christ himself, priest, prophet, and king. Priest because it's what in theology we call soteriological. In other words, it's about the sacerdotal office of communicating salvation to others. So that's the priestly function. As in the Old Testament, you had the priests of the Old Law, we have the priests of the New. And all of those foreshadowed the priests of the New. So when you look at it that way, we receive that in our baptism. We are priest, we are prophet, which doesn't mean we're called to foretell the future, but we're called to speak the truth to others, and the truth will have consequences in history because we speak the truth, because we say what God has said, not because we make it up and say what we say. And so the prophetic office is closely associated with the teaching office or the role of teaching. And so parents teach others, you may teach a colleague about the faith. This is an exercise of the prophetic office. And the kingly office is you might say, the servant office by which as laymen and women, by which as priest, bishop, or deacon, you serve others according to the duties and responsibilities of that office. So you have those three things going on. And then in marriage, when a man and a woman marry, they have to embrace the intention and purposes of that life, which is that it's till death do you part. In other words, it's indissoluble except by death. That it's a communion of the persons, it's unitive, but it's also procreative, and it has to be open to life. And this is obviously where the offense of contraception gets in between that. And so a person who blocks either of those intentions and says, well, yeah, I'm going to marry, but I'm going to fool around on the side, is invalidly marrying. Or I'm going to marry, but where I'm not going to let her have any children, even though there are reproductive years, doesn't validly marry. Now, with the priesthood, it's a little bit different. If the man blocks the intention, and I attended an ordination once where the sister of one of the ordinands got up in the pulpit, and she said, and she obviously was a feminist of some kind, who said, well, I'm only happy that my brother has entered, this patriarchal nonsense because I know he doesn't actually believe in the hocus pocus. Well, if he has no idea and intention of embracing the specifics of his priestly office to confect the sacraments, that he has the power to do that, especially with regard to the Holy Eucharist, that would be a case of an invalid ordination. But many men, of course, they are going along, they're in the seminary, they don't have any doubts about any of that, they're ordained. Moral defects come up in them. It's just like if down the road in a marriage a moral defect comes up, doesn't give you a right to divorce and remarry. If your marriage is valid at the beginning, it's valid then. If your priestly ordination is valid at the beginning, it's valid then. So all that can be done to such priests is to laicize them or to punish them in other means if it's a defect that I don't know what it would be, but something lesser than these kinds of sexual things we've been hearing about, or the corrupting things we've been hearing about. So there are some differences there in the sacraments that probably argue that the overwhelming majority of priestly ordinations are valid. And I only, in my own experience in talking to people over the last now 45 years or so in different ways in which I had some religious Catholic-oriented capacity, I know of only that one case which I myself saw, and I think the invalidities were probably less in the past. Now, whether they are in places where the seminary formation was poor and the men did not intend to do what the Church intends by ordaining them, then yes, you could have a validity case. And those go directly to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. They're the only ones who can adjudicate whether an ordination was valid or not. And I think it's quite rare. But then let's say the priest does do one of these evil things we've heard talked about. What's his next obligation? Well, in point of fact, a priest, bishop, or a bishop or the priest, they're going to baptize, confirm, confect the Eucharist, hear confessions, anoint the sick. They're supposed to be in the state of grace for all of those. That's a serious obligation. So I think the greatest sin in here is the offense against holiness. Yes, human beings suffer, and that's a terrible evil. Murder is an evil, for example, by comparison. But yet the Church would consider the desecration of the Eucharist a greater evil because the one offended is greater than any human individual that you might kill. The one offended is God himself. And when you offend God, there's a certain infinity to that offense. And so the sacrilege of celebrating Mass or any of the sacraments in the state of mortal sin without having made a perfect act of contrition, as canon law says a priest must do, because after all, a priest could be out in the boonies and have nobody to confess for. But he has an obligation to repent and to elicit from himself an act of contrition based on the offense against God. That's what the perfect act of contrition is. You know, I am sorry because I've offended you, my God, who art so good and so deserving of all my love. That's what the perfect act of contrition is. But, of course, it has to be interior. It has to be real. It can't be just words coming out of the mouth. A priest who doesn't do that and commits a sacrilegious or performs a sacrament sacrilegiously has thrown coals on his own head. So this is why I think this is a very deep corruption, because not only are the crimes against human beings, which are absolutely awful, the subversion of seminarians in formation for the priesthood, absolutely awful, and in itself almost sacrilegious. They're not yet priests, but the priest himself, who just going from doing one sacrament to another without any real conversion. In fact, the lifestyles we hear about are evident of just exactly that. No conversion at any time in the course of decades. In other words, no valid confessions, piling up the debt of the sins committed that are sacrilegious, as well as against the sixth commandment. There's a lot to be here, and I think there needs to be some good theological studies done regarding the depth of the wound against the church and the depth of that wound in relationship to the very things you talked about, the priestly office, the acting in persona Christi in mortal sin, sexual sin, sacrilege, and perpetuating that without a truly valid confession or evidence of a conversion. This is a profound corruption, as many are saying.
God bless you, John. We certainly appreciate that phone call from New Brunswick in the great country north of us in Canada. And it should certainly be noted, Colin, that these heinous actions that that are being brought to light here recently all fly in the face of the teaching of Holy Mother Church. And it's important that you get your news from a source that is going to give deference to what Holy Mother Church actually teaches. And I would recommend Catholic News Agency. It's the only fast, reliable, and free Catholic news source that compiles blogs, stories, opinions, and much more right at your fingertips at one website. So for the latest Catholic news from a Catholic perspective, visit CatholicNewsAgency.com. It's an online service from EWTN News. Next stop for us, the Windy City. William is in Chicago listening to EWTN Radio. William, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Hello. How are you?
Hey, William. Go ahead.
I just had a question. It's just a personal question that I'm trying to understand. Maybe the last 5 or 6 years, I feel that I've been on a tailspin. I worked for the church for a long time. Tried to do apologetics, and I think I was kind of successful and so on. But it comes down to prayer, where maybe after about 5 years or so, it's going on the 6th year, where I just keep praying to God for a certain intention. And I went to all these theology on taps and Bible studies where they talk about prayer, trying to understand what I'm doing wrong or what I'm not listening to. And, this has developed into like a severe anger, depression. I mean, just because even if God says no, there's no understanding of why or what should I do next. So it's I don't know what to do. Yeah.
Sure. No, I think from a very human point of view, that's first of all, it's hard discerning what God's answer is, except in the case of no. You pray for something, it doesn't happen, you think, well, he's not listening or he doesn't want me to have it. And I think that at that point, we have to sort of begin to think, well, how am I going to conform my will? What am I not understanding here? What is the reason God would not want me to have this? Or is he simply asking me to wait and persevere, like our Lord often counseled, perseverance? I know this often comes up with people who are looking for spouses, especially in a time when there sometimes seems to be a good shortage of Catholic men if you're a woman, or Catholic women if you're a man. We know they're all out there, and somebody's finding them, but it's just not you or something of this nature. That's certainly a common problem today, and that can be very, very difficult. And but we can continue on. You mentioned doing church work. We can continue on serving the Lord in the ways and the opportunities that have given us. And that's where I think the backing away from our own will is so important. It doesn't mean that necessarily that we have to renounce what is for us a deep desire for something. Let's say it's a particular vocation or a particular kind of occupation or job that we would like to find, and we just can't, and we're doing menial things or things we don't like to do. Or a child who has strayed from the faith, and we're praying and praying and praying, and they don't seem to be getting any closer. Now, in the case of other people, it is sort of a difficulty because if we're praying for something that involves a human decision by another person, the only person we can affect is ourselves. And even God, although he can make the providential circumstances appear, let's say for converting a relative, he can maybe bring people to association with our relative to enlighten them regarding something in their life, whether it's a drug issue or sex addiction issue or lack of faith or whatever it is. God can work those providential circumstances, so we can never give up on that. But the thing he won't do is he won't jump into that person's will and make them return to the church or make them choose to marry this person or hire that person or that. So God's ways are very mysterious in how he's answering prayer. So ultimately, we're forced to evaluate our side of the equation, since that's the only one that's in our control. We can choose to keep discerning and praying and hope for and ask God even to enlighten us regarding what his will is. Or we come to the conclusion ourselves that, well, maybe I'm not asking for something, really useful to me, and then we go on about our way. But it depends a lot on us, because God doesn't change. God will still be there. He's not going to change because we're unhappy with the results. So we have to contemplate, well, what is there in me that I can change, perhaps in my intention? Or if I discern that, no, I really feel like I need to continue to pray about this, you do. And I know lots of people who pray for things for literally years. And, of course, parents often pray for decades. But I also hear very many stories of those last-minute conversions or the thing that the parent or somebody prayed for, the spouse, good spouse they were looking for or whatever it is, that, boom, suddenly in a moment they weren't expecting. And so detachment also helps as to the timing of anything. Trusting in God and detaching from our own will in it. So that'll bring a lot of peace, and so I counsel that.
Quickly, we'll head to the great state of New Jersey. Michael's in New Jersey watching on YouTube. Michael, a couple minutes left with Colin. What's your question?
Thank you. If a pope is invalidly elected, how can they be deposed?
Well, that would come about because the evidence is there in the conclave. It's not something that can come about in any other way. So if you're talking about our day as opposed to, for instance, when we had 3 popes, where a pope was elected, others rejected the election and they created their own pope, and then another group created their pope, and at one point there were 3 popes, not because the first was likely invalid, but because those who were dissatisfied with it went off and did their own thing. There is absolutely no evidence, for example, that in the conclave of 2013, anything was done that would invalidate that election. The other cardinals would be obliged to say so. Nobody has done that. The things that are alleged about power cliques and so on who are irrelevant because papal law makes them irrelevant. Those individuals who would do something contrary to the law are excommunicated. Their vote is valid because the church simply could not have the situation of an invalid pope, and so has done everything legally and canonically to ensure that popes are valid. Not necessarily that we all love what they do, but that at least they are the pope.
Next week is Theology Roundtable. What's your topic, Colin?
Well, we're going to talk about atonement. We have the Feast of the Holy Cross and Our Lady of Sorrows coming up. And boy, do we have a lot of atoning to do, and a lot of individuals in particular. So we're going to go into the theology of that a little bit.
On behalf of our host, Colin Donovan, our producer and social media maven, Mr. Michael McCall, and our call screener, Michael Birchfield, I'm Jack Williams. Thanks for another great week of EWTN's Open Line. Have a tremendous Labor Day weekend. Back at it with John Martinoni on Monday. Until then, God bless.